Okay, so yeah, welcome everyone to this week's session of the UCL InfoSec Research Seminar. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Chelsea Komlo as today's seminar speaker. And Chelsea is currently pursuing her PhD at the University of Waterloo in the Cryptography, Security and Privacy Lab. And besides that, she's also involved in many other endeavors, including being a technical advisor at the Zcash Foundation and a board member at the Tor project. And Chelsea has been working for already a very long time on engineering problems and is also lead author on many different cryptographic designs. And some of that work we'll see today, namely a new threshold signature scheme. And yeah, with that, Chelsea, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. I look forward to meeting many of you after this. I'm also familiar with a lot of your work. So yeah, so I'm really excited to hear questions or thoughts or like discussion about related work. So thank you so much for having me. And I wish it was in person, but maybe one day in the future.
Yes, yes.
So yes, but I'm really excited to have this discussion with you. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, you can see this, right?
Yes.
Great.
Works perfectly.
I also, cool. So if there's a question, please just shout it out because I can't actually see the Zoom chat or anything. So please just let me know.
Yeah, if there's a question on the chat, I'll read it out loud and forward
Perfect.
it.
Excellent. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about some recent work that I've done that's called Frost. This was done in collaboration with Ian Goldberg, who's my advisor at the University of Waterloo. And this was done in conjunction with the Zcash Foundation and CRISP at the University of Waterloo. And Frost stands for Flexible Round Optimized Schnorr Threshold Signatures. Oh no. Okay. So before getting into what threshold signatures are, I'm just going to talk quickly about what threshold secret sharing is. And many of you are probably familiar with this, but just in case you're not, what a threshold secret sharing scheme is it's a scheme that takes a secret and it partitions it among a set of participants. And it does that partitioning in such a way that recovering or using the secret afterwards requires cooperation among some threshold number of participants. And so Shamir secret sharing is probably the threshold secret sharing algorithm you're most familiar with. It's kind of often synonymous with secret sharing schemes. And this is what Frost builds upon as well. So we kind of use Shamir secret sharing as an underlying primitive in what we build our work upon. And just in terms of notation, here we'll use N, and this is kind of general in the secret sharing literature, but we'll use N to represent the total number of allowed participants in the secret sharing scheme. And we'll let T denote the threshold. So we kind of talk about T and threshold signature schemes where T is the threshold and N's the total number. And so you might ask, like, okay, this sounds cool. Why would you actually use secret sharing in practice? And some of the most often cited reasons that we hear about, one is disaster recovery. So if you think about maybe you have some secret document and it's about like some government and you don't want it to be destroyed, but you also don't want to kind of like scatter it to the winds because it's sensitive. So secret sharing schemes have been proposed as a mechanism to kind of safeguard secret material while also being robust against disasters. Another often cited reason to use secret sharing schemes is raising the bar for compromise against some adversary. So an adversary doesn't need to compromise just one machine or one participant, they would need to compromise a threshold. And then kind of going along with both of these, secret sharing schemes are often cited as a benefit because they partition trust among some set of participants. So you don't have kind of all of your trust invested in one person or organization, they're sort of partitioned among many. And this is kind of the appeal of secret sharing schemes to practitioners. So making this a little bit more concrete, so if we're thinking about a 2 out of 3 threshold signature scheme, say you have one participant, they hold one share of this overall secret. If their computer is destroyed for whatever reason, you're still able to recover that secret because you might have 2 other participants, their secret shares have not been compromised, and so they can kind of work together in order to recover the secret. So this is kind of the example of where secret sharing schemes are useful against disaster recovery. And then kind of thinking about the adversarial example, so in threshold signature schemes, we do assume that a participant can be malicious and that they can hold secret shares themselves. However, in this 2 out of 3 setting, if only one of your participants is malicious and your 2 other participants are honest, that means that the adversary would need to compromise one of the honest players in order to control the secret. But this does kind of require the assumption that the adversary controls fewer than 2 participants in order to remain secure. So when we talk about security and threshold schemes, we talk about security underneath some level. So the adversary is allowed to compromise up to some number of actual participants, but so long as it doesn't exceed like the threshold or some other number. Okay, so that's kind of threshold secret sharing more generally. And then we talk about threshold signatures as kind of a subset of threshold schemes, or we build on top of threshold secret sharing schemes. So again, similarly to the setting that we just saw, in threshold schemes, we do have a T out of N structure where we have N possible signers, T of which are required to sign. But in this setting, this secret share represents the secret signing key. And then all of these participants, or this kind of group, is represented by one joint public key. So to the rest of the world, this entity is kind of like one entity. There's one public key, but internally the secret signing key is partitioned in this T out of N access structure. And what's interesting about this setting, as opposed to the secret sharing, the plain secret sharing setting, is that when signing is done, the full secret is actually never reconstructed. So unlike Shamir secret sharing, where after performing the algorithm, you kind of hold the secret, the secret after it's been reconstructed, in the threshold signature setting, participants perform signing using their secret share, but they never kind of like recombine the full secret altogether. And so that's nice, again, in terms of like limiting the footprint of exposure. So they don't kind of share secret material, they only perform signing. And then again, something that's kind of nice is that the signature that's issued in a threshold setting can look identical to a single party signature. And this is attractive for privacy and backwards compatibility reasons. So basically a signature that you issue in a threshold setting can look as though only one entity signed that. So you don't leak this kind of like T out of N number, which is nice for like, you know, there's not kind of metadata that's being leaked. And also because you can then use the same verification algorithm for both single party signatures and multi-party signatures. And then just kind of thinking about some applications of threshold signing. So where these have been discussed as potentially being beneficial is in the setting, for example, in certificate authorities. So we all kind of know about certificate authorities issuing bad certificates. So threshold signing can be used in order to raise the bar to an adversary. Threshold signing has also been discussed in terms of distributing Tor's consensus. So Tor requires signing their consensus by some number of directory authorities, all which agree on the state of the network. And so threshold signing can be beneficial here in that only one signature is issued as opposed to N. So that's kind of nice for bandwidth reasons. Another really kind of hot topic right now is signing financial transactions in blockchain settings. So in order to release funds, you might need some kind of T signers in order to spend funds. And in general, this kind of like distributed authentication of threshold signing is attractive when some minimum number of signers is required to do something. So if you want to verify some signature, it's nice when you can say, oh, not just one entity has signed this, but some cohort. And I kind of want to do a quick segue to compare threshold schemes against a very similar notion in the literature, which are often referred to as multi-signature schemes, somewhat confusingly. But I want to do this just because it can be a little confusing what we mean by threshold versus multi-signature. And by multi-signature, what we mean is essentially just a compact representation of n signatures over some message, and the message can be the same or different depending on the scheme. In a multi-signature scheme, every signer has their own public-private key pair, and there's no enforced access structure in the actual primitive itself. So as opposed to threshold schemes where there's this T out of n access structure over the secret key, a multi-signature scheme is essentially just n signers over some message, and the signing group can be dynamic, as opposed to a threshold scheme where the signing group is determined at the time of key generation. However, both can be represented by a single public key, depending on the scheme that's used. So just to kind of get a frame of reference, when I think about where are threshold signature schemes useful versus where are multi-signature schemes useful, this is kind of how I differentiate between the two. Okay, so I told you that today we're going to talk about Frost, which is our work. So that's kind of just a little background on threshold secret schemes and threshold signature schemes and where they sit in the literature. So Frost in particular is a 2-round threshold signing protocol, or a single round protocol with pre-processing. And what we mean by round is the number of messages that need to be sent among signers in order to issue a signature. So by 2-round, we mean participants need to send kind of 2 network rounds to each other in order to issue a signature, or a single round, similarly. And what's interesting about Frost is that signing operations are secure even when they're performed in this kind of concurrent setting. And this actually improves upon prior work in the literature. So we'll get into this a little bit more, but prior work in the literature had a forgery attack when multiple signing operations could be opened at once, and Frost remains secure in this setting. And another thing that's nice about Frost is that signing can be performed with a threshold T number of signers. T can be less than or equal to n. So other schemes in the literature required either all signers or the number of participants that an adversary had to corrupt might be less than T. And here in Frost, you need to perform signing with T number of signers, and it is secure against an adversary that controls up to T-1 signers. And so in the literature, among this is true for any kind of distributed protocol that requires kind of agreement upon state, there's trade-offs among the constructions. So some trade-offs among threshold signature constructions are the number of signing rounds. So that I alluded to that earlier. So that's the number of network rounds required to generate one signature. Another trade-off is whether or not the protocol is robust. So this is essentially represents whether or not the protocol can complete if any of the participants misbehave. So a robust protocol is one which, if a participant misbehaves, the protocol can continue and a signature can be issued at the end, versus a non-robust protocol is one where if any of the participants misbehave, it requires aborting and kind of rerunning the protocol. Another trade-off is the required number of signers. So as I kind of spoke about before, a trade-off is, can the signature be created by just T participants or all N? And then finally, kind of again, is is the protocol secure even when done in parallel? So this was sort of a sticking point in literature prior to Frost, is some signatures were fine as long as they were only done kind of one at a time versus being done in parallel. And this is known in the literature as the driver's attack. And so a paper was published by a set of authors, Drivers et al., which looked at a bunch of schemes in the literature and sort of said, actually, all of these have a very similar forgery attack that's possible. And so just a brief comparison of where Frost sits against some Schnorr threshold signature schemes. So Stinson-Strobel is one kind of often cited example. So Stinson-Strobel requires 4 signing rounds among participants. It is robust, so if any of the participants misbehave, there's kind of a mechanism to kick them out and continue in the protocol. There's not really a good pre-processing round, so these 4 rounds kind of need to be done all at once when issuing the signature. However, it does allow for T number of signers, and it is secure in a parallel setting. So another Schnorr-based threshold signature protocol is by Schnorr et al., published a little after Stinson-Strobel. And this only requires 2 rounds. It's not robust, so it does require aborting the protocol if any misbehavior occurs. It does allow for pre-processing, so one of these rounds can be kind of batched. So then it only requires 1 round during signing. However, the scheme requires all N participants to cooperate in order to issue a signature, and it's not secure in this parallelized setting. And so Frost kind of sits in the middle. So similarly to Schnorr et al., we allow for a 2-round signing protocol, but it can be pre-processed into kind of this batch pre-processing protocol and then a single round signing protocol. It's not robust, so if misbehavior happens, the protocol must abort and be rerun. However, we allow for only a T number of signers, T out of N, and it is secure in this parallelized setting. Okay, so that's kind of where Frost sits in comparison to some of these other schemes. So I'm going to quickly review single-party Schnorr signing and verification, just so we have in our head how does Schnorr signing with only 1 participant work, and then we can look at how we actually do this in a threshold setting. So for single-party Schnorr, the signer will start by performing keygen, where they generate some public-private key pair. And then in order to sign a signature, a verifier will send some message M to be signed with respect to the public key Y. And then the signer will first start by randomly sampling some nonce, and then they'll generate the commitment to this nonce. So this is essentially just, well, we'll see how this is essentially just a zero knowledge proof of knowledge with respect to this message M. So then they'll generate the challenge, which is essentially just the hash of this commitment R, their public key Y, and M. This challenge sometimes includes the public key, sometimes it's just the commitment in the message, but here we sort of show this in the ed DSA-like style. And then their response is essentially just using this nonce in combination with the challenge and their long-lived secret key, this X value. And so then their signature over this message M is essentially this public commitment R, and then their response Z. And so then what the verifier does to verify that this signature is valid is they begin by rederiving the challenge value. All of the values in this hash are public, and so they can rederive this themselves. And then they rederive this R primed value. And they do this by taking the response Z and kind of combining it with the signer's public key and then this rederived challenge value. And the signature is valid if this R primed commitment is equal to the commitment issued in the signature. And so this essentially is a zero knowledge proof of knowledge of this secret X, but over some message M. Okay, so that's single party Schnorr. So now we'll look at how to perform signing that issues signatures in exactly the same format as a single party Schnorr signature, but in a threshold setting. So as we saw, first we need to perform key generation for this signing protocol. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. There's two ways that this can be done in Frost. So keygen can be performed either using a trusted dealer, similarly to in Schnorr secret sharing, or you can use what's called a distributed key generation protocol. And what's kind of different between these two settings is that this DKG, this distributed key generation protocol, is essentially an n-wise Schnorr secret sharing protocol where every participant acts as the dealer. And so what this essentially achieves is key generation where no party is trusted any more than any other party. So if you want all of your participants to be equally trusted, you'd use this DKG protocol. Whereas if it's okay that, you know, one of your parties is sort of trusted in this dealer way, you can just do regular Schnorr secret sharing with a bit of a twist. So, but what's important is that after this key generation protocol, every participant holds a secret share SI, and then they also have their own public key YI, but this is sort of used only internally within the protocol for verification. And then everyone is represented by this joint public key Y. So regardless of whether you do a DKG or regular Schnorr secret sharing, at the end, every participant has their own secret key, and then everyone's represented by this joint public key Y. Okay, so now we'll look at Frost signing. So as I said, Frost signing can be performed in 2 rounds, or it can be optimized to a single round with pre-processing. And here we show this with a role that we call signature aggregator, but you don't need this role. All participants can sort of work with each other without this kind of coordinator role. But we show this here for simplicity and because this is likely what will actually be used in practice. And note that these roles are used just for coordination, so they don't actually require any kind of more additional trust. Okay, so the first round of Frost signing. So I'll show this as this kind of pre-processing round and signing round, but note that this can be done as the first round to this 2-round protocol. So for Frost signing, every participant will start by selecting 2 nonces, this little dij, little eij, and then they'll generate 2 commitments to those nonces. And so this is a little analogous to what we saw in single party Schnorr, but in this case, every participant actually generates 2 nonces and 2 commitments. And then they can be doing this in batch, which is sort of why we have these IJs here. So then they'll store these values locally, and then they'll publish their commitments somewhere. So again, this is kind of in the batched pre-processing setting where they can store these public commitments anywhere. So like a commitment server, for example. And this entity is storing public values, so they're only trusted to kind of store them. They can't actually do anything malicious with these public values. So yeah, as I said, in the 2-round variant, the step is performed immediately before the signing round with only 1 commitment, or you can do this in a batched setting. Okay, so then the second round for Frost signing, we show this with a signature aggregator. Essentially what's important is that to start the signing round, we require this B value. And essentially what this B value is it's the commitments for every participant that will be participating in the signing operation, along with their identifiers. So here, for example, we can see that participant 1 through T will be participating, and then we'll be using sort of these commitments for each participant. And then every signer receives the message to be signed M, and then this B value that contains commitments for all of the signers. And to start, what they do is they generate what's called this binding factor row. And what this binding factor row is it's just the hash or they generate essentially one row for every signer. And that's just the hash of the participant identifier, the message to be signed in this B term. And what this row value does, as we'll see, is essentially binds every participant's signature to this identifier, to the message, and to this B term. And then after generating this binding factor row, all participants will derive their joint group commitment R. And this is the product of every signer's commitment, kind of in combination with this binding factor. So these two steps, deriving row and deriving R, every signer does this upon signing, and they all derive the same values. Then every signer, exactly to how we saw before in single party Schnorr, will derive the challenge, which is just the hash of the commitment, the public key, and the message. However, note in this setting, this R and Y value represent the whole group as opposed to one signer. And then they'll generate the response. And so in this setting, the response uses these two nonces, those little di and little ei, kind of again in combination with this row value. And you can kind of think about these as like hiding and binding factors. So this little ei binds to this row term, and then this little di is kind of the hiding factor. And then their signature part uses their little si, so that's their long-lived secret signing share, in combination with the challenge, exactly the same as in single party Schnorr. And then this lambda I term is essentially just allowing us to do additive secret sharing. So this lambda I term is just because this little si is a Shamir secret sharing of the secret signing key S. So this lambda I allows us to essentially use this little si additively. So what's important here is that this di plus ei times rho I can't be inverted by anyone who doesn't know little di and little ei. So we sort of do this to protect against kind of removing this binding factor and kind of tying this signature share to the message and the signing cohort. Okay, so once every signer generates their response ZI, they'll send that back to the signature aggregator. And then the signature is, again, this value R, which represents the group's commitment. And then the sum of all of the ZIs. So the overall signature is just the sum of all of the kind of signature shares generated by every signer in this protocol. And again, what's nice is the signature format and verification are identical to single party Schnorr. So that's kind of what's really attractive about this signature scheme. Okay, so I kind of emphasize that this binding factor is really important. And so let's look and see what would happen if we actually didn't have this binding factor. So let's say we did that signing protocol before, but we didn't use this binding factor. So I told you that this would be insecure against the driver's attack. And so we can see that without this binding factor, an adversary could produce some challenge C star, that is the hash of some commitment R star, Y, M star. But that can actually be equal to the sum of some other challenge values CI for some other commitment values RI and MI. So by the driver's attack, we know that this C star that's equal to some sum of other challenge values, this can be found efficiently. So we know that this is possible. And then an adversary would do this, they would pick some set of RI-MIs so that this challenge value C star is found. And then they would send kind of all of the terms necessary for the victim to sign. So after the victim signs and returns their response ZI, the adversary would be able to produce a valid forgery over the commitment R star as the sum, again, of these little DIs plus little EIs plus the long-lived signing key plus, and this was essentially evaluate to the sum of all of these challenge values. So recall that each challenge value is over some RI-MI. And so then this signature would be over kind of this sum if you combined all of them. And then this term would evaluate to some signature over a challenge C star that the victim actually did not sign. So overall, what's important in this attack is that essentially if every signature share is not bound to some specific R and M, they can be combined in such a way that you can produce a forgery with respect to some message and commitment that the victim actually did not sign. So importantly, this binding factor rho makes it so that every response is strongly tied to some message and some commitment. So kind of looking here at this bottom line, this is what Frost does, is it includes this binding factor. So if an adversary tried to combine these signature shares as in the attack above, it would actually result in an invalid signature, because even though they would have some set of challenge values that summed to some C star, we have this binding factor here that wouldn't kind of combine nicely, that would essentially just result in an invalid signature. So overall, this is what thwarts the driver's attack. Okay, so we saw how Frost holds up against this kind of very specific attack in the literature. Let's talk about the protocol complexity. So one thing that's nice about Frost is that the per signer bandwidth overhead scales linearly relative to the number of signers. And so this is different than some other protocols that require many rounds among participants. So essentially, just because of this B term, we send one additional commitment tuple for every signer. So that value will scale linearly, but that's about it. However, the total bandwidth overhead scales quadratically. So, but this would be similar to kind of any protocol where you have multi-party signers. And then if you assume using these kind of centralized roles for coordination, the network round complexity remains constant. If you don't want these kind of centralized roles, the network round complexity does grow. But again, this is similar to any kind of multi-party signing protocol where you have a lot of signers kind of interacting with each other. I guess really quickly about the security. So in the paper, we prove existential unforgeability against Trojan message attacks. And we prove this against an interactive variant of Frost. And then we show how this security extends to plain Frost. And we do this in that Frost Interactive generates this binding value rho via a one-time BRF. And the reason why we do this is so that our simulator can kind of simulate parallelism. So we do this more for our simulation to actually show that our security is proven in this fully parallelized setting. However, our plain non-active Frost protocol generates rho via this hash function. So we essentially model this hash function by this one-time VRF, and we say that because these two primitives have similar properties such as determinism and unpredictability, we can kind of move from this interactive version to this non-interactive version. So one thing I think we're most excited about with Frost is that there are real world applications kind of that are interested in using Frost today. So sort of the most immediate setting where it's planning to be used is by the Zcash protocol in order to sign financial transactions. And Frost is attractive in this setting because of the privacy reasons. So signatures that are published to the blockchain won't be able to be differentiated based on the number of signers. So this is kind of a nice application here. But Frost right now is under consideration for standardization by the CFRG, which is part of the IETF. So there has been a lot of interest in kind of standardizing threshold signatures in general, and Frost is currently under consideration as one of these candidates. And so we've heard a lot from practitioners that are interested in using threshold signatures everywhere from kind of the Tor setting to kind of signing with HSMs. So that's something we're pretty excited about. And one thing that was pretty cool is we got to present Frost at a NIST workshop that happened a couple of weeks ago on standardizing threshold schemes. So we were able to meet with other kind of practitioners and NIST people and talk about what's important when you standardize these kind of threshold signing protocols. And Frost, we did present Frost there, and we received a lot of kind of good feedback and also validation for some of the assumptions that we made, such as, kind of using these coordinator roles in order to simplify protocol complexity, and also kind of trading off robustness for improved round performance. So yeah, so hopefully in the future, we'll see Frost actually in use and hopefully standardized. Okay, so we kind of had a whirlwind tour of threshold secret sharing schemes in general, threshold signature schemes, Frost, the whole literature. What are some of the important takeaways from this talk?
Okay. Did we just lose Chelsea?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
So for our work specifically, really simple. It's not too hard to reason about, and it's flexible. And that's what makes it attractive to RealWorld applications. So overall, the simplicity of Frost is what has made practitioners kind of really interested in digging in and looking at using it in practice. And you can find more, so you can find our paper and artifact at this URL here. And I'm looking forward to questions and hearing thoughts and takeaways from you. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chelsea, for this really nice talk. And I think we lost you again. Okay, I guess I'll stop the recording and then we'll move over to the Q&A session and we'll figure out the rest.